The first thing Chloe registered was the cold, a deep, biting cold that seeped through the flimsy silk of her cocktail dress and into her bones, a brutal shock to a system accustomed to the carefully calibrated climate of New York City high-rises. The second was the smell, a raw, earthy scent of pine and damp soil, so alien to her usual world of curated floral arrangements and the faint metallic tang of city smog. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a brutal counterpoint to the jarring, almost oppressive silence of the wilderness. She pushed herself up, her movements sluggish, her mind a thick fog. Her manicured hands, usually adorned with a discreet but expensive diamond ring, sank into the soft, damp earth. A gasp, sharp and ragged, escaped her lips as she took in her surroundings. Towering pines, their jagged peaks scraping against a bruised pre-dawn sky, surrounded her in a silent, intimidating circle. This was not the plush, climate-controlled suite of the Four Seasons in Jackson Hole where she was supposed to be. This was nowhere, a primal, untamed wilderness that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness, a sensation she hadn't felt since her early days as a junior associate facing a panel of senior partners. She looked down at herself, a fresh wave of nausea rolling over her. Her dress, a shimmering silver creation by a designer whose name was a byword for effortless elegance, was torn at the hem and stained with a gruesome mixture of dirt and something darker. A large, angry bruise was blooming on her forearm, a violent splash of purple against her pale skin, and in her right hand, held in a death grip, was a rock. It was heavy, jagged, and slick, with something dark, sticky, and horrifyingly familiar. Blood. Her blood. She frantically checked herself for any major injury, her hands trembling as they patted down her body. But aside from a few scrapes, the burgeoning bruise, and the relentless throbbing in her head, she seemed to be intact. Her gaze, drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't suppress, fell upon a shape a few feet away. It was a man, lying face down in the dirt, his limbs splayed at an unnatural angle. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the kind her fiancé, Richard, favored, a silent testament to a world of power and influence. It was Richard's business associate, a man named Marcus, the man she was supposed to meet, the man she was supposed to deliver a package to, a package Richard had been deliberately vague about. His head was turned at an angle that defied the laws of anatomy, and a dark, viscous pool was spreading from beneath him, staining the pristine wilderness a gruesome shade of crimson. Chloe's breath hitched in her throat, a strangled sob catching in her chest. The rock in her hand suddenly felt 1,000 pounds heavier, a tangible symbol of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Fragments of memory, sharp and disjointed, flashed through her mind like a broken film reel. A heated argument in a dimly lit parking garage, Marcus's face contorted in a sneer, his voice a low, menacing growl, a shove that had sent her stumbling backwards. And then, nothing. A black, terrifying void. Did she do this? The question screamed in the silence of her mind, a hysterical, high-pitched shriek that threatened to shatter her sanity. She, Chloe Thompson, a corporate lawyer on the fast track to a partnership, a woman whose life was a carefully curated masterpiece of ambition and success. A murderer? It was impossible. It was insane. But the blood on the rock, the dead man at her feet, the gaping hole in her memory, it all pointed to a truth too horrific to comprehend. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the canopy of trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor, a new sound broke the silence, the soft, rhythmic thud of hooves on damp earth. A lone rider emerged from the trees, a silhouette against the rising sun, a figure of myth and legend brought to life. He was a cowboy, straight out of a movie, with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face and a rugged, weathered look that spoke of a life lived under the open sky. He rode with an easy, unhurried confidence, a man who was one with the wild, untamed landscape. He pulled his horse to a stop a few feet away, his stormy gray eyes taking in the scene with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He looked at the dead man, his gaze lingering for a moment on the expensive suit that was so out of place in this rugged wilderness. He looked at the blood-stained rock in Chloe's hand, his expression unreadable. And then he looked at her terrified, tear-streaked face, at the torn silk of her dress, at the wild, hunted look in her eyes. This was it, the end of her life as she knew it. He would call the sheriff. Her carefully constructed world, a world of power lunches and courtroom victories, would come crashing down around her. She would be arrested, charged with murder, her name and face splashed across the tabloids. The career she had worked so hard to build, the future she had so meticulously planned, it would all be gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a prison cell. But the cowboy didn't reach for a phone. He simply sat there, a silent, enigmatic figure on his magnificent horse, his gaze fixed on her. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes, the raw, unadulterated panic of a woman who was not a cold-blooded killer, but a terrified victim. And in that moment, Weston Black, a man who had learned the hard way to be wary of outsiders, a man who had built a fortress around his heart, made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, a silent language of reassurance. He walked towards her, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his presence a strange mixture of intimidation and comfort. He reached out a calloused hand, not to take the rock, but to help her up. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low rumble, as steady and as solid as the mountains that surrounded them. "We need to get you out of here." Chloe stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She should scream, she should run, she should do anything but trust this stranger, this silent, enigmatic cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, a flicker of compassion, a hint of a shared loneliness that made her take his hand. He led her to his horse, lifting her onto the saddle with an ease that belied his lean frame. He swung himself up behind her, his body a warm, solid presence against her back, a shield against the cold, harsh reality of her situation. And as they rode away from the scene of the crime, away from the dead man and the blood-stained rock, Chloe Thompson, the city girl who had always been in control, surrendered herself to the mercy of a lonely cowboy and an impossible love that was about to be born in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. The journey to his cabin was a blur, a surreal, dreamlike sequence that Chloe's traumatized mind couldn't fully process. She was vaguely aware of the rhythmic sway of the horse, of the strong, steady arms that held her secure, of the rugged, majestic landscape that passed by in a green and brown blur. They arrived at a small, isolated cabin, nestled in a grove of aspen trees, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was a simple, rustic structure, but to Chloe, it was a sanctuary, a refuge from the horror she had left behind. Wes helped her down from the horse, his touch gentle but firm, his presence a quiet, reassuring anchor in the storm of her emotions. He led her inside, the cabin's interior as Spartan and as functional as the man himself. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple wooden table and a couple of chairs stood in the center of the room. A small, functional kitchen occupied one corner, and a sturdy ladder led to a loft that served as a bedroom. There was no television, no computer, no Wi-Fi router, no sign of the modern world that Chloe was so accustomed to, a world that now felt 1,000,000 miles away. "You're safe here," Wes said, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "For now?" Chloe looked at him, her eyes wide with 1,000,000 unspoken questions. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and raspy. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a murderer." Wes looked at her, his gaze unwavering, his stormy gray eyes seeming to pierce through the layers of her carefully constructed persona. "Because I know what it's like to be lost," he said, his voice a low rumble, resonating with a depth of emotion that surprised her. "And because I believe that everyone deserves a second chance." His words, so simple and yet so profound, were a balm to her shattered soul. She had been so quick to judge him, to see him as a simple, uneducated cowboy, a relic from a bygone era. But in that moment, she saw something else. She saw a man of quiet strength, of deep integrity, of a compassion that was as vast and as untamed as the land he called home. But the fragile truce between them was short-lived, as the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her situation. Chloe's survival instincts kicked in. She was a lawyer, a fighter, a woman who was used to being in control. She couldn't just sit here, a damsel in distress, waiting for a cowboy to save her. She had to get back to her life, to her career, to the man she was supposed to marry. "I need to call my fiancé," she said, her voice regaining some of its usual authority, a familiar weapon in her arsenal of self-preservation. "I need to call the police. I need to clear my name." "There's no cell service here," Wes said, his tone flat, a statement of fact that was not open to negotiation. "And the nearest town is a 2-hour drive away, assuming you could even find your way there. Besides, calling the police is the last thing you should do right now." "And why is that?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with a sarcasm that was her default defense mechanism, a shield against the vulnerability that threatened to overwhelm her. "Because you were found at a murder scene with a bloody rock in your hand," Wes said, his words a cold, hard dose of reality, a bucket of ice water on the flames of her rising hysteria. "Because you have no memory of what happened. Because as far as the law is concerned, you're the prime suspect." His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had been so focused on her own innocence, on her own version of the truth, that she hadn't considered how it would look to anyone else. She was trapped, a prisoner in this remote cabin, her fate in the hands of a man she didn't know, a man she had every reason to fear. As if on cue, the sky outside began to darken, the clouds gathering in a menacing formation. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful wolf, a symphony of nature's fury. The first drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. A storm had rolled in, a fierce and violent tempest that mirrored the turmoil in Chloe's soul. They were trapped, not just by the circumstances, but by the raw, untamed power of nature itself. The days that followed were a tense, claustrophobic dance of suspicion and reluctant dependence. Chloe, with her sharp tongue and her city-bred arrogance, clashed with Wes, with his quiet stoicism and his unwavering connection to the land. She was a woman who was used to bending the world to her will, and he was a man who had learned to live in harmony with it. They were two sides of the same coin, two lonely souls who had been brought together by a cruel twist of fate, their forced proximity a constant source of friction and a strange, unsettling attraction. But as the storm raged outside, something began to shift between them. Chloe, stripped of her designer clothes and her high-powered career, began to shed the layers of her carefully constructed persona. She learned to chop wood, her hands, once soft and manicured, now calloused and sore. She learned to build a fire, the simple, primal act of creating warmth and light, a source of immense satisfaction. She learned to cook a simple meal, her culinary skills, once limited to ordering takeout from the finest restaurants in New York, now extending to a surprisingly delicious rabbit stew. She was a quick study, her sharp mind and her tenacious spirit adapting to the challenges of her new environment. And Wes, who had initially been wary of this city woman with her sharp tongue and her high-maintenance ways, found himself impressed by her resilience. He saw a strength in her that he hadn't expected, a fire that had been buried beneath layers of ambition and success. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the storm a wild symphony outside, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin, Chloe turned to him, her eyes shining in the firelight, her usual mask of cool composure having slipped away. "Thank you," she said, her voice a soft whisper, a sound so fragile it was almost lost in the roar of the wind. "For everything." Wes looked at her, his gaze fixed on the flames, his profile a study in stoicism. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I told you everyone deserves a second chance." "Even a murderer?" Chloe asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question a heavy weight in the air between them. Wes turned to look at her, his stormy gray eyes meeting hers, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking directly into her soul. "I don't believe you're a murderer, Chloe," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "I believe you're a victim." His words, so simple and yet so powerful, were a lifeline in the storm of her despair. He believed her. This stranger, this lonely cowboy, this man from a world so different from her own, believed in her innocence when she couldn't even believe in it herself. And in that moment, for the first time since she had woken up in the cold, dark wilderness, Chloe Thompson felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The storm that had trapped them in the cabin was a physical manifestation of the tempest in Chloe's soul, a wild, untamed fury that mirrored the chaos of her shattered life. For days, the rain lashed against the windows in a relentless, percussive rhythm. The wind howled through the trees like a mournful wolf, and the world outside was a blur of gray, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. But inside the small, rustic cabin, a fragile truce had been declared, a delicate ceasefire in the war between their two worlds. The initial shock and suspicion had given way to a quiet, reluctant acceptance of their shared predicament, a strange sort of intimacy born of a shared danger and a shared solitude. Chloe, stripped of her designer clothes and her high-powered career, was a fish out of water, a creature of the city cast into the heart of the wilderness. She had spent her entire life in a world of concrete and steel, a world where success was measured in billable hours and courtroom victories, a world where the only predators she had to fear were the sharks in expensive suits who sat across from her in the boardroom. Here, in the heart of the untamed wilderness, those things meant nothing. Here, survival was the only currency that mattered. And so, under Wes's quiet, patient tutelage, she began to learn. She learned to chop wood, her hands, once soft and manicured, now calloused and sore, a testament to a new kind of labor, a new kind of strength. She learned to build a fire, the simple, primal act of creating warmth and light, a source of immense, almost spiritual satisfaction. She learned to cook a simple meal, her culinary skills, once limited to ordering takeout from the finest restaurants in New York, now extending to a surprisingly delicious rabbit stew, a dish she would have once turned her nose up at, but now savored with a hunger that was as much emotional as it was physical. She was a quick study, her sharp, analytical mind, and her tenacious, unyielding spirit adapting to the challenges of her new environment. And Wes, who had initially been wary of this city woman with her sharp tongue and her high-maintenance ways, found himself impressed by her resilience. He saw a strength in her that he hadn't expected, a fire that had been buried beneath layers of ambition and success, a spirit that was as wild and as untamed as the land he called home. They fell into a strange sort of domesticity, their days filled with the simple, rhythmic tasks of survival. They would work together, their movements a silent, unspoken choreography, a dance of two people who were learning to move in rhythm with each other. They would talk, their conversations a mix of a grudging curiosity and a shared, palpable loneliness. Chloe would tell him about her life in New York, about the cutthroat world of corporate law, about the man she was supposed to marry, a man who now seemed like a stranger from a different lifetime. And Wes, in turn, would find himself sharing stories of his own, stories of his life on the ranch, of his deep, abiding love for the land, of the woman who had broken his heart. She couldn't handle the isolation, he said one evening, his voice a low rumble, his gaze fixed on the flames that danced in the fireplace, a mesmerizing ballet of light and shadow. She said she loved me, but she loved the city more, the noise, the crowds, the constant motion. She said this place was too quiet, too empty. She said it was killing her soul. Chloe listened, her heart aching for the pain she could hear in his voice, a pain that was as raw and as real as the day it had been inflicted. She understood, in a way that surprised her, the woman's choice. She had been that woman, a woman who had chosen ambition over love, a woman who had been so focused on the destination that she had forgotten to enjoy the journey. She had been so busy climbing the corporate ladder that she had forgotten to look at the view. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a soft whisper, a sound so fragile it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Wes just shrugged, a gesture of resignation that spoke volumes, a silent testament to a pain that had become a part of him. "It was a long time ago," he said, his tone flat, his emotional walls firmly in place. But Chloe could see the flicker of pain in his eyes, the ghost of a love that still haunted him, a shadow that danced with the flames in the fireplace. As the storm began to subside, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle, a new, more immediate threat emerged. A menacing black SUV, a jarring intrusion of the modern world into their isolated sanctuary, was spotted on the ridge overlooking the cabin. It was a silent, menacing sentinel, a stark reminder of the danger that still lurked outside, of the world that Chloe had tried so desperately to escape. "They're looking for you," Wes said, his voice grim, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that was mounted above the fireplace. "The people who were involved in the murder, they know you're a loose end, and they're not the kind of people who leave loose ends." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Chloe, a familiar, unwelcome visitor. She had been so focused on her own survival, on her own innocence, that she had almost forgotten about the larger conspiracy that she had stumbled into. Her fiancé, Richard, the man she had trusted, the man she had planned to spend the rest of her life with, he had used her. He had sent her into a dangerous situation, a pawn in his twisted game of power and greed, a disposable asset in his ruthless pursuit of wealth and influence. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a poison that spread through her veins, leaving a trail of anger and betrayal in its wake. She had been so blind, so willing to ignore the red flags, so seduced by the promise of a life of wealth and success. She had been a fool, a willing participant in her own deception. "We need to get you out of here," Wes said, his voice pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts, his words a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. "It's not safe for you here anymore." But leaving was not an option. The SUV was a constant presence on the ridge, a silent, menacing predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were trapped, their small cabin a fragile fortress against a world that was closing in on them, a world that was determined to silence Chloe for good. The days that followed were a tense, nerve-wracking waiting game, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. They would take turns keeping watch, their senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, a potential threat. The forced proximity, the shared danger, the adrenaline that coursed through their veins, it all created a new, intoxicating intimacy between them, a bond that was forged in the crucible of fear and desire. One afternoon, as they were hiding in the woods, the SUV having driven closer to the cabin than ever before, the tension between them finally snapped. They were pressed together behind a large boulder, their bodies so close that Chloe could feel the heat radiating from Wes's body, could hear the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. He looked at her, his stormy gray eyes dark with an emotion that she couldn't quite name, a mixture of fear and desire and a fierce, protective tenderness. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss that was born of fear and desperation, of a shared loneliness and a burgeoning desire. It was a kiss that was as wild and as untamed as the land that surrounded them, a kiss that tasted of rain and pine and the raw, elemental passion that had been simmering between them since the moment they had met. It was a kiss that changed everything. The world outside, with its danger and its uncertainty, faded away. All that mattered was the man who was holding her, the man who had saved her, the man who had seen the woman she could be, not just the woman she had been, the man who had looked at her, a broken, terrified woman with blood on her hands, and had seen not a murderer, but a victim. When the kiss finally ended, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. The line between them had been crossed, the unspoken attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface, now a raging fire that threatened to consume them both. "I'm sorry," Wes said, his voice hoarse, his usual stoicism shattered by the force of his emotions. "I shouldn't have done that." "Don't be," Chloe said, her voice a soft whisper, her hand reaching up to cup his rough, unshaven cheek. "I'm not." In the days that followed, the tension between them was a different kind of tension. It was a tension of a shared desire, of a love that was as impossible as it was undeniable. They were two people from two different worlds, two people who had been brought together by a cruel twist of fate. But in each other's arms, they found a strange sort of solace, a temporary reprieve from the danger that still lurked outside, a fragile, beautiful hope in the midst of their shared nightmare. Chloe, with her sharp legal mind, began to piece together the events of that fateful night. She went over every detail, every conversation, every nuance, her mind a courtroom where she was both the prosecutor and the defendant. She realized that the package she was supposed to deliver was not just a simple business transaction, but a payoff, a bribe, a piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. She realized that her fiancé was not just a shrewd businessman, but a criminal, a man who was willing to sacrifice her to save himself, a man who had never loved her, but had only loved the idea of her, the beautiful, successful, ambitious woman who was the perfect accessory to his life of power and privilege. And Wes, who had long ago resigned himself to a life of solitude, found himself opening up to her in a way he never had before. He told her about his dreams, about his fears, about the deep, abiding love he had for his family's ranch, a love that was as much a part of him as the blood that flowed through his veins. He showed her the beauty of his world, the simple, profound joy of a sunrise over the mountains, the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work, the deep, abiding peace of a life lived in harmony with the land. They were falling in love, a slow, inevitable descent into a passion that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. They were two lonely souls who had found each other in the heart of the wilderness. Their love, a fragile flower, blooming in the most unlikely of places, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. But the world outside was not going to let them be. The black SUV was a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked, of the life that Chloe had left behind, of the impossible love that they were trying to build in the shadow of a murder, a love that was as fragile and as beautiful as a wildflower blooming on the edge of a cliff. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the cold fear that still lingered in the air, Chloe turned to Wes, her expression serious, her eyes filled with a new, steely resolve. "I can't hide here forever," she said, her voice firm, the voice of a woman who had been to hell and back and had emerged stronger. "I need to face them. I need to clear my name. I need to take back my life." Wes looked at her, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was almost a physical pain. He wanted to protect her, to keep her safe in his isolated world, to build a fortress around her and never let her go. But he knew that he couldn't. She was a fighter, a woman of strength and resilience, a woman who was not meant to be caged. She was a woman who would not hide from a fight. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble, a promise, a vow, a testament to the love that had grown between them. "And you won't have to do it alone. I'll be with you, every step of the way." His words were a promise, a vow, a testament to the love that had grown between them. They were two people from two different worlds, but they were united by a shared purpose, a shared love, a shared hope for a future that was as uncertain as it was beautiful, a future that they would have to fight for, together. The decision was made, a silent pact forged in the flickering firelight. They would no longer be prisoners in their own sanctuary, hunted animals cowering in the shadows. They would face the threat head-on, turning the tables on their pursuers. The days of hiding were over. The time for confrontation had arrived. Chloe, with her sharp analytical mind, a mind that had once dissected complex legal contracts, now dissected the problem of their survival. And Wes, with his intimate knowledge of the rugged, unforgiving terrain, a knowledge that had been passed down through generations of his family, became her co-conspirator, her partner in a desperate, high-stakes game of chess against an unseen, ruthless opponent. They used the daylight hours to prepare, turning the cabin and the surrounding wilderness into a makeshift fortress, a testament to their shared ingenuity and their will to survive. Wes, with a grim, quiet determination, set a series of traps, subtle, non-lethal snares designed to disorient and delay, to turn the wilderness that was his home into a weapon against their enemies. He moved with the silent, deadly grace of a predator, his every action infused with a purpose and a precision that was both terrifying and beautiful to watch. Chloe, meanwhile, used her legal prowess to think like the enemy. She anticipated their moves, their strategies, their likely points of attack. She was no longer a terrified victim, but a formidable adversary. Her mind a weapon as sharp as any knife. Her resolve as hard as the granite mountains that surrounded them. The waiting was the hardest part. a slow, agonizing torture that stretched their nerves to the breaking point. The nights were long and filled with a tense, palpable silence, a silence that was broken only by the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the frantic beating of their own hearts. They would sit by the fire, the warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear that gnawed at them, their hands clasped together in a silent gesture of solidarity. In those quiet, stolen moments, they found solace in each other's arms, their love a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness, a fragile, beautiful thing that was worth fighting for, worth dying for. They were two soldiers on the eve of battle, their shared vulnerability forging a bond that was stronger than steel, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of fear and desire. "I'm scared," Chloe admitted one night, her voice a soft whisper against Wes's chest, a confession of a weakness she had never allowed herself to show before. "I've never been this scared in my life." "I know," he said, his arms tightening around her, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through her, a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. "But we're in this together. Whatever happens, we face it together." The attack came at dawn, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful, ironic backdrop to the violence that was about to unfold. The black SUV, a harbinger of doom, rolled up the dirt track, its engine a low, menacing growl that shattered the morning stillness. Two menacing figures emerged from its dark interior, their faces grim, their movements precise and efficient. They were professionals, their cold, detached air a chilling testament to a life of violence and brutality. But Chloe and Wes were ready. The first man, a burly, thick-set individual with a face like a clenched fist, ventured into the woods to circle the cabin, his movements a little too confident, a little too arrogant. He was caught in one of Wes's snares, his leg tangled in a rope that left him dangling upside down from a tree, his surprised yelp quickly turning into a string of enraged curses. The second man, alerted by the shouts of his partner, charged towards the cabin, his gun drawn, his face a mask of grim determination. This was Chloe's cue. She had set up a simple but effective diversion, a series of pots and pans tied to a tripwire, a makeshift alarm system that was as ingenious as it was low-tech. As the man approached the cabin, he stumbled, the clatter of metal echoing through the silent woods, a jarring, discordant symphony that shattered the morning peace. It was the distraction they needed. Wes, who had been hiding in the shadows of the porch, a silent, coiled spring of pent-up energy, tackled the man from behind, the two of them crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs, a chaotic, brutal ballet of violence. The fight was brutal and primal, a raw, unfiltered struggle for survival. The man was bigger and stronger than Wes, a mountain of muscle and brute force. But Wes was a man who had been forged in the fires of the wilderness, a man whose strength was not just physical, but a deep, primal connection to the land he called home. He fought with a raw, untamed ferocity, his movements economical and precise, his every action infused with a desperate, unwavering will to survive. Chloe, watching from the window, her heart in her throat, knew that she couldn't just stand by, a helpless spectator in the fight for their lives. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen, her hand steady, her mind clear, her every nerve singing with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She ran outside, her bare feet pounding against the cold, hard earth, a warrior woman in a borrowed flannel shirt. She brought the skillet down on the man's head with a sickening thud, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious, a fallen giant in a sea of green. It was over. They had won. They were alive. They were safe. The aftermath was a blur of police sirens, flashing lights, and the cold, impersonal questions of law enforcement. The two men were arrested, their connections to a larger criminal organization quickly uncovered. The investigation into the murder of Richard's associate was reopened, and Chloe, with Wes by her side, his hand a steady, reassuring presence in hers, told them everything she knew. The truth, as it often does, came out in a messy, complicated torrent, a story of greed and betrayal, and a love that had been born in the most unlikely of circumstances. Richard was arrested, his carefully constructed world of wealth and power crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. He was charged with a litany of crimes, from money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. His name and face splashed across the headlines, a fallen titan in a world that had once worshipped him. Chloe, once his fiancée, the beautiful, successful woman who had been the perfect accessory to his life of power and privilege, was now the star witness for the prosecution, her testimony the final nail in his coffin. She was cleared of all suspicion, her name officially and publicly exonerated, but the victory felt hollow, a bitter, unsatisfying end to a chapter of her life that she wished she could erase. The life she had known, the career she had worked so hard to build, the future she had so meticulously planned, it was all gone, replaced by a gaping void, a sense of emptiness that was as vast and as desolate as the Wyoming wilderness. She returned to New York, a city that had once been her kingdom, but now felt like a foreign land, a place where she no longer belonged. The towering skyscrapers, once a symbol of her ambition, now felt like a cage, their cold, impersonal facades a reflection of the emptiness in her own heart. The hustle and bustle of the city, once a source of energy, now felt like a relentless, soul-crushing noise, a constant reminder of a life that no longer fit. She dismantled her old life with a ruthless efficiency, a surgeon excising a cancerous tumor. She quit her job, sold her apartment, and cut ties with the people who had been a part of her gilded cage. The people who had been so quick to judge her, so quick to abandon her. She was free, but she was also adrift, a ship without a rudder, a traveler without a map. She and Wes spoke on the phone every day, their conversations a lifeline in the sea of her uncertainty, a fragile thread that connected their two disparate worlds. But the distance between them was a painful, ever-present ache, a constant reminder of the impossible love that they were trying to sustain. He was in Wyoming, bound to his land, a man who was as much a part of the wilderness as the mountains and the trees. And she was in New York, a city that no longer felt like home, a woman who was lost in a sea of concrete and steel. After weeks of soul-searching, of long, lonely nights spent staring at the city lights, a city that had once been her playground, but now felt like a prison, Chloe knew what she had to do. She booked a one-way ticket to Wyoming, a leap of faith into an unknown future, a future that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. She arrived at the ranch unannounced, her heart pounding in her chest, a wild, chaotic rhythm that mirrored the turmoil in her soul. Wes was in the corral, breaking in a young, spirited colt, his movements a beautiful, hypnotic dance of man and beast. He looked up as she approached, his stormy gray eyes widening in surprise, a look of disbelief, of hope, of a love that he had never dared to express, transforming his rugged, weathered face. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate, a question in his eyes, a silent, unspoken plea. "I was a lawyer," Chloe said, her voice a little shaky, but her resolve firm, her gaze meeting his, a silent promise of a new beginning. "A good one," And I've been thinking, ranchers like you, you're the backbone of this country. But you're being squeezed out by big corporations, by predatory lenders, by a system that's rigged against you. You need someone to fight for you, someone who understands the law, someone who's not afraid to take on the big guys. She took a deep breath, her heart in her throat, her future hanging in the balance. I want to be that person, she said, her voice filled with a newfound purpose, a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in years. I want to build a new life here, with you. I want to build a bridge between our two worlds. Wes looked at her, his heart overflowing with a love so fierce it was almost a physical pain. He had never dared to hope, had never dared to dream, that she would choose him, that she would choose his world, a world that was so different from everything she had ever known. But here she was, a woman who had faced her demons and had emerged stronger, a woman who had found her own path, a woman who was offering him a future he had never thought possible, a future that was as bright and as beautiful as a Wyoming sunrise. He didn't say a word. He simply closed the distance between them, his arms wrapping around her in a tight embrace, his body a warm, solid anchor in the storm of her emotions. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his emotions, a silent, heartfelt prayer of gratitude. "Welcome home, Chloe," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears, a sound so raw, so vulnerable, so full of love that it brought tears to her own eyes. They stood on the porch of his cabin, the same porch where they had once sat as prisoners, a place that had once been a symbol of their confinement, but was now a symbol of their shared future. They looked out at the endless horizon, at the majestic mountains that had once been a symbol of their isolation, but now represented the strength and the resilience of their love, a love that had been born in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that had conquered all, the city girl and the lonely cowboy. Their love had been born in the shadow of a murder, had been forged in the fires of adversity, had been tested by the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It was an impossible love, a love that had defied all the odds, a love that had bridged the gap between two disparate worlds. But it was real, it was true, and it was theirs. Home, Chloe realized, as she stood in the arms of the man she loved, was not a place. It was not a city or a ranch or a house. It was a person, and she was finally and forever home.